Imagine the rhythmic clang of metal against metal, the crackle of a roaring forge, and the sweat dripping from a weary brow. Being a blacksmith in medieval times might sound romantic, crafting swords, armor, and tools from raw iron. But the reality, it was exhausting, relentless, and often thankless work. In this sleepy journey through history, we'll explore why the life of a medieval blacksmith was far less glamorous than you might think. Let's dive into the daily grind, literally. In medieval society, becoming a blacksmith wasn't as simple as picking up a hammer and striking hot metal. It began with a long, grueling apprenticeship, a period of servitude that could last anywhere from 5 to 10 years. Boys as young as 7 or 8 were sent away from their families to live with a master blacksmith, often in cramped, smoky quarters that doubled as a workshop and living space. The young apprentice's first task was to observe. For hours, sometimes days, he would stand in the corner of the forge, watching the master and journeyman work. He would study how they heated the metal to the right temperature, how they wielded the hammer, and how they shaped glowing iron into horseshoes, nails, and tools. It was a test of patience, as apprentices were not allowed to touch any of the tools for months, sometimes even a year. The master would demand total obedience, and a single misstep could result in a harsh reprimand or worse. When the time finally came for the apprentice to handle tools, it was usually the broom. The forge was a constant mess of ash, soot, and metal shavings. The apprentice's duty was to sweep the floor, shovel out the ash, and keep the fire stoked. It was back-breaking work. The heat from the forge made the air thick and stifling, and the constant lifting and bending took a toll on a boy's body. But even the act of stoking the fire was a lesson in discipline. If the flames burned too hot, the metal would warp or crack. If they weren't hot enough, the iron would refuse to bend. It was an early introduction to the demanding precision that defined blacksmithing. As time passed, the apprentice would be allowed to handle small tools. The master would hand him a piece of scrap iron and instruct him to shape it into a simple nail. The first attempts were almost always disastrous. The iron might twist and bend, or the hammer blows might be too heavy, shattering the brittle metal. Each mistake was met with a stern lecture or a clipped ear. The master had no time to coddle a clumsy apprentice, and each error was another hour of work wasted. The forge was not a place for softness or sympathy. The apprentice was also responsible for maintaining the tools, a never-ending chore. Hammers would chip and crack, tongs would warp, and the anvil would need regular cleaning and oiling. The blacksmith's tools were his livelihood, and the apprentice was tasked with keeping them in top condition. This was more than just busy work. It was a way to familiarize the boy with the feel of each tool, its weight, its balance, and its specific use. The apprentice learned that a hammer was not just a blunt instrument, but a precise extension of the hand, capable of shaping metal with finesse or brute force. Living conditions for an apprentice were bleak. They often slept on a thin straw mattress in the corner of the forge, with only a ragged blanket for warmth. The forge was perpetually hot, even at night, but the heat did little to chase away the chill of a medieval winter. Food was meagre, a crust of bread, a bowl of porridge, a chunk of cheese if they were lucky. The master provided room and board, but he was under no obligation to provide comfort. Apprentices were expected to endure hardship without complaint. After all, they were learning a valuable trade. Aside from the physical toil, there was the social aspect of apprenticeship. Apprentices were at the bottom of the social hierarchy within the forge. Journeymen, who had completed their own apprenticeships but had not yet earned the title of master, were quick to bully and belittle the young newcomers. Tasks that no one wanted to do, the dirtiest, hottest, most monotonous jobs, were dumped onto the apprentices. The older apprentices, often enforced a strict pecking order, asserting their dominance over the younger ones. Fights were common, and the master rarely intervened. It was all part of the unspoken curriculum: toughen up or get out. The apprentice was also forbidden from working on personal projects. Every strike of the hammer was for the master's gain. If the master secured a lucrative contract to produce horseshoes for the local lord or weapons for a knight, the apprentice was expected to work tirelessly alongside the journeymen to complete the order on time. They would work through the night, sweat pouring down their faces, hands blistered and raw. And when the order was finally completed, the master would collect the payment, and the apprentice would receive nothing but another day of grueling labour. Yet for all the hardship, apprenticeship was also a time of learning. The master might begrudgingly share a trick or two, a way to bend iron without cracking it, a technique for tempering steel to make it harder, a method for inscribing a maker's mark onto a finished product. The apprentice was expected to absorb these lessons like a sponge, committing every detail to memory. There were no written manuals or blueprints. Every piece of knowledge was passed down verbally, from master to apprentice, and the price of forgetting was a swift blow to the back of the head. Years would pass, and the apprentice would grow taller and stronger. His hands, once soft and smooth, would become rough and calloused, the skin thickened from years of hammering and lifting. He would learn to move in sync with the other workers, to anticipate the master's instructions before they were spoken, to strike the iron at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right way. The apprentice might even earn a nod of approval from the master, a rare but treasured sign of respect. But the apprenticeship was far from over. The apprentice had yet to produce a masterpiece, a single, flawless work that would prove he was ready to become a journeyman. The pressure was immense. A single flaw, a single crack or misalignment could set him back months or even years. And so, he toiled on, day after day, night after night, dreaming of the day he would finally be allowed to step out from beneath his master's shadow and claim a forge of his own. Before any hammer could strike metal, the blacksmith needed raw materials. In medieval times, finding those materials was no simple task. Iron, the lifeblood of a blacksmith's work, was not something you could just pick up from a local supplier. It had to be mined, smelted, and transported, an arduous process that was riddled with challenges, dangers, and expenses. Iron ore was often extracted from open pits or rudimentary mines. The work was grueling and perilous. Miners dug through layers of rock and soil, their hands blistered and raw from using crude tools. In deeper mines, the air was thick with dust, and the risk of cave-ins was constant. Many miners never lived long enough to see the fruits of their labor. For the blacksmith, each piece of iron that arrived at the forge carried a hidden cost, the suffering and death of the men who pulled it from the earth. Once the ore was extracted, it had to be smelted, a labor-intensive process that transformed raw ore into workable iron. This required large amounts of charcoal, another resource that was not easy to come by. Entire forests were cut down to produce charcoal, which was created by slowly burning wood in large earthen pits. The process could take days, and the resulting charcoal was precious. Blacksmiths had to be careful not to waste it, as acquiring more meant either paying a high price or spending days laboring to make it themselves. Transporting iron to the forge was another ordeal. Roads were little more than muddy, rutted paths that became impassable during heavy rains or winter snows. Merchants hired oxen or horses to haul the heavy loads, but theft was common, and bandits lurked along isolated stretches of road. Blacksmiths sometimes had to strike deals with armed escorts or pay local lords for protection. Even then, there was no guarantee the shipment would arrive intact. When the iron finally reached the forge, it was often in a crude, impure state. Medieval iron was riddled with slag, a byproduct of the smelting process. Before the blacksmith could shape it into anything useful, he had to refine it. This involved hours of heating, hammering, and reheating to drive out impurities and consolidate the metal. It was exhausting, repetitive work, and any mistake could ruin the entire batch. There was also the matter of quality. Not all iron was created equal. Some deposits produced soft, brittle iron that was useless for making durable tools or weapons. Blacksmiths had to inspect each piece carefully, tapping it with a hammer, feeling its weight and examining its grain structure. Experienced blacksmiths could identify good iron by its sound. A clear, ringing tone indicated solid, workable metal, while a dull thud suggested flaws or impurities. Yet, even with the best iron, there was still the problem of scarcity. Iron was expensive, and blacksmiths operated on thin margins. Wasting even a small amount could mean financial ruin. To maximize their resources, blacksmiths often recycled old tools, weapons, and scrap metal, melting them down to create new items. But this presented its own challenges, as recycled iron was often of lower quality and harder to work with. Occasionally, blacksmiths would strike deals with local lords or wealthy merchants to secure a steady supply of iron in exchange for their services. This might involve producing weapons, armor, or horseshoes on demand, effectively binding the blacksmith to a single patron. While this provided some security, it also meant that the blacksmith was at the mercy of his benefactor. If the lord fell out of favor or lost his fortune, the blacksmith could be left without resources to keep his forge burning. The blacksmith's quest for materials also extended to other metals like copper, tin, and occasionally even precious metals like silver and gold. These were even harder to come by, reserved mostly for specialized items like ornate swords, religious relics, or decorative fittings. Acquiring these metals required connections with traders or merchants, who often charged exorbitant prices. Iron was also subject to taxation. In some regions, lords claimed a portion of every shipment, either as a direct levy or as a gift in exchange for protection. This could significantly cut into a blacksmith's profits, forcing him to work twice as hard to make ends meet. Some blacksmiths attempted to bypass these taxes by smuggling iron or buying it on the black market, but this was a risky gamble. If caught, the punishment could be severe: fines, imprisonment, or even the confiscation of their forge. Beyond metals, the blacksmith needed other supplies: coal, wood, water, and clay for the forge and bellows. Each had to be sourced separately, and each came with its own costs and difficulties. Woodcutters charged for timber, well owners for water, and miners for coal. The blacksmith had to maintain a delicate balance, carefully budgeting his resources to ensure that he had enough fuel to keep the forge hot and enough metal to keep the hammer striking. Thus, before a single piece of iron could be shaped into a sword or a plowshare, the blacksmith had already expended days, sometimes weeks, of effort simply acquiring the raw materials. It was a constant struggle, a cycle of labor, barter, and debt that weighed heavily on even the most experienced blacksmiths. And yet, despite the toil and expense, the forge had to keep burning. Because in a world where everything was built by hand, the blacksmith was both indispensable and expendable. A craftsman whose entire livelihood depended on the next load of iron arriving on time. In a medieval forge, the fire was the beating heart of the operation. Without it, the blacksmith was powerless. But keeping that fire burning was an exhausting, never-ending task. Unlike modern forges, which run on gas or electricity, medieval blacksmiths relied on charcoal or coal, both of which required constant attention and maintenance. First, there was the matter of starting the fire. The forge was typically lit early in the morning, often before dawn, when the air was still cold and damp. The blacksmith or his apprentice would crouch down beside the hearth, striking flint against steel to create a spark. If the tinder was too damp, it wouldn't catch. If the charcoal was too coarse, it wouldn't burn evenly. The entire process could take an hour or more, and it was a frustratingly delicate operation. Once the fire was finally lit, it had to be fed continuously. Charcoal burned quickly, far faster than wood, and maintaining a steady, even heat was critical. Too cool, and the iron would refuse to bend. Too hot, and the metal would crack or melt. The blacksmith had to keep a close eye on the flames, adding more fuel whenever they began to wane. This meant hauling heavy baskets of charcoal back and forth, the hot embers scorching through thin gloves, the air thick with acrid smoke. But it wasn't just about throwing more fuel onto the fire. The blacksmith had to control the airflow as well, using a pair of bellows, a massive leather contraption that looked like a cross between a fan and a lung. The bellows were typically operated by the apprentice, who would stand for hours, pumping air into the fire, each pull and push as rhythmic as a heartbeat. The apprentice's arms and shoulders would ache from the effort, and sweat would pour down his face as the heat from the forge blasted his skin. Yet he couldn't stop. If the bellows slowed, the fire would weaken, and the blacksmith's work would be ruined. Even with constant attention, maintaining the right temperature was a delicate dance. Medieval blacksmiths didn't have thermometers to gauge the heat. They relied on sight and intuition. The color of the flames and the glow of the metal were their only guides. A dark cherry-red glow indicated a low temperature, suitable for bending or shaping soft metals. A bright orange or yellow glow meant the iron was ready to be forged. But if the metal started to sparkle or emit white-hot sparks, it was dangerously close to melting, a catastrophic failure that could ruin a valuable piece of iron. Then there was the issue of ash and clinker. As charcoal burned, it left behind ash, which built up quickly at the base of the forge. If left unchecked, the ash could smother the fire, reducing its intensity and filling the workshop with choking smoke. The blacksmith or apprentice had to regularly shovel out the ash, a filthy, grueling task that left them covered in soot. Worse than ash, though, was clinker, a hard, glassy residue formed when impurities in the charcoal or ore fused together. Clinker was heavy, sharp, and difficult to remove, and it could block the airflow, causing the fire to burn unevenly. Blacksmiths had to pry it out with long metal rods, risking burns and blisters in the process. Removing clinker was a job no one wanted, but one that had to be done several times a day. Weather also played a significant role in managing the forge. On hot summer days, the heat inside the workshop could become unbearable, the forge radiating waves of searing air that left blacksmiths drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. In winter, the bitter cold made it harder to keep the fire going, as gusts of wind would blow through the cracks in the walls, snuffing out embers and chilling the blacksmiths to the bone. On rainy days, the damp air made it difficult to keep the charcoal dry. Wet charcoal was nearly useless, producing more smoke than heat and causing the fire to sputter and die. If the blacksmith couldn't keep a steady supply of dry charcoal on hand, he'd be forced to wait for the rain to pass, losing valuable hours of work. And then there were accidents. A single misstep could send a shower of hot embers flying, burning exposed skin, or setting clothing alight. The forge was a dangerous place, filled with sharp tools, blistering heat, and heavy metal. Blacksmiths were constantly on edge, their senses heightened, their muscles tensed, ready to dodge a flying spark or a collapsing pile of coal. Apprentices were especially vulnerable, their inexperience making them prone to careless mistakes. Despite all this, the fire had to be kept burning. If the forge went cold, it could take hours to get it back up to temperature, hours that the blacksmith couldn't afford to lose. And so, the work continued, feeding the fire, stoking the flames, pumping the bellows, shoveling out ash, and scraping away clinker, day after day, from sunrise to sunset. Keeping the fire burning wasn't just a physical task, it was a mental one. The blacksmith had to remain focused, attuned to every hiss and crackle, every shift in the fire's color and intensity. A lapse in concentration could mean overheating a valuable piece of iron or allowing the fire to die out at a crucial moment. In this sense, tending the fire became a meditative act, a ceaseless ritual of labor and vigilance. And yet, for all the effort, the fire remained a fickle, temperamental thing. Some days, the charcoal burned perfectly, the flames rising high and hot, the iron heating evenly and quickly. Other days, the fire refused to cooperate, the flames sputtering and hissing, the bellows creaking under the strain. It was a constant battle, a daily struggle to keep the forge alive, to keep the work going, to keep the hammer striking. The forge was a brutal place. Every day, the blacksmith and his apprentice faced hours of relentless, punishing labor in a hot, smoky, and often suffocating environment. The heat was the first and most obvious hardship. The forge fire roared like a dragon, its flames licking the walls and radiating an intense, searing heat that could be felt even from across the room. Blacksmiths worked inches away from this inferno, sweat pouring down their faces, their clothes soaked through, their skin red and raw from the constant exposure. The smoke was another relentless enemy. Charcoal fires produced thick, acrid smoke that clung to every surface, filling the air with a choking haze that stung the eyes and burned the throat. The forge was usually housed in a small enclosed structure with minimal ventilation, allowing the smoke to collect in dense, swirling clouds. Blacksmiths breathed in this toxic air day after day, their lungs coated with soot and ash. Chronic coughing and respiratory issues were common, and older blacksmiths often developed a persistent, hacking cough that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Then there was the soot, a fine black dust that settled on every surface, including the blacksmith's skin, hair, and clothing. It got under the fingernails, into the eyes, and up the nose. It mixed with sweat, forming a grimy paste that left blacksmiths perpetually dirty, no matter how often they tried to wash. At the end of each day, the apprentice would stagger home, his face streaked with soot, his hair stiff with ash, his skin reeking of smoke and burnt metal. The physical layout of the forge added to the misery. The work area was cramped and cluttered, with tools scattered across every surface and piles of scrap metal heaped in corners. The floor was often dirt or packed clay, uneven and riddled with potholes and shards of discarded iron. There was little room to move, and blacksmiths had to navigate the space carefully, dodging swinging hammers, red-hot metal, and buckets of water used to quench heated iron. The tools themselves were heavy and unwieldy. The main hammer, a massive, iron-headed sledge, could weigh as much as 10 or 15 pounds. Swinging it repeatedly, hour after hour, was a workout that pushed the blacksmith's muscles to their limits. Every blow had to be precise, the right angle, the right force, the right spot on the iron. A missed strike could send metal shards flying or damage the piece beyond repair. Apprentices, still developing their strength and coordination, struggled to keep up, their arms and shoulders screaming from the exertion. Anvils were equally unforgiving. Made of solid iron and weighing several hundred pounds, the anvil was the blacksmith's primary work surface. It was cold, hard, and merciless. Every time the hammer struck the metal, vibrations ricocheted through the iron, up the hammer's handle, and into the blacksmith's arms. The constant impact caused joint pain, muscle strain, and, over time, permanent damage to the wrists, elbows, and shoulders. Many blacksmiths developed arthritis, or carpal tunnel syndrome long before middle age, their hands twisted and gnarled from years of repetitive motion. Burns were an unavoidable part of the job. The forge was filled with glowing metal, and even a brief lapse in attention could result in serious injury. A misplaced hand could brush against a red-hot iron rod, leaving a blistering burn that would take weeks to heal. Sparks flew constantly, tiny embers that could embed themselves in the skin, causing sharp, searing pain. Larger pieces of metal, fresh from the fire, were even more dangerous. If dropped or mishandled, they could cause severe burns, melting through cloth and searing flesh in seconds. Injuries extended beyond burns. Blacksmiths were surrounded by sharp tools, chisels, files, and tongs that could slip or be dropped at any moment. The apprentices' hands were often a patchwork of cuts and scrapes, some shallow, some deep enough to leave permanent scars. Infection was a constant threat, as even minor wounds could fester and turn septic in the filthy, unsanitary conditions of the forge. There were no antibiotics, no disinfectants, and no bandages beyond what could be improvised from rags and scraps of cloth. The work itself was monotonous, a ceaseless cycle of heating, hammering, quenching, and repeating. Every horseshoe, every nail, every blade required the same basic steps, the same rhythmic pounding, the same endless repetition. For the apprentice, it was especially mind-numbing. Day after day, he would swing the hammer in the same motion, at the same angle, striking the same piece of metal until his muscles burned and his mind went numb. There was no room for creativity, no opportunity for innovation, just the relentless mechanical grind of the forge. And yet, despite the monotony, there was constant pressure to perform. Blacksmiths were craftsmen, and their reputation depended on the quality of their work. A single flawed horseshoe could cause a horse to go lame, bringing shame upon the blacksmith and potentially ruining his business. A poorly forged blade could shatter in battle, costing a knight his life. Every piece had to be perfect, every strike precise, every inch of metal shaped with care and skill. The stress was immense, and the stakes were high. The mental toll of this pressure was compounded by the lack of rest. Blacksmiths worked from dawn until dusk, often 7 days a week. There were no weekends, no holidays, no vacations. The forge had to keep burning, and the work had to keep flowing, especially during times of war or harvest when the demand for tools and weapons surged. Exhaustion was a way of life, and sleep was a fleeting, interrupted thing. Blacksmiths fell into bed each night with aching muscles and throbbing joints, only to rise again before sunrise, to start the cycle all over. For apprentices, the conditions were even worse. They were at the mercy of the master, who could demand extra hours, force them to perform the dirtiest, most grueling tasks, and punish them for the slightest mistake. The master's temper was as unpredictable as the forge fire, and apprentices lived in a state of constant anxiety, always waiting for the next order, the next scolding, the next impossible task. In the end, the forge was less a workshop than a crucible, a place where bodies and spirits were tested, where skin blistered, muscles ached, and patience frayed. It was a place where every hour felt like a day, every day like a week, every week like a lifetime. And yet, for those who endured, the forge was also a place of transformation, where raw, unyielding iron could be shaped into something useful, something valuable, something that might, just might, change the course of a life. The blacksmith's workday began before the first light of dawn. While most of the village still lay asleep, the blacksmith and his apprentice were already on their feet, moving through the frigid pre-dawn air toward the forge. The workshop was cold and dark, the air thick with the stale scent of old smoke and cooling iron. The first task was to get the fire going, a tedious and frustrating chore that often took longer than expected. The apprentice would crouch by the hearth, fumbling with flint and steel, striking again and again, his fingers stiff with cold. Sparks would fly, but fail to catch. The charcoal, still damp from the night air, refused to ignite. Each unsuccessful strike was met with the growing impatience of the master, who stood over the boy, arms crossed, his shadow looming large in the dim light. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tinder would catch, a tiny flicker of flame that had to be carefully nursed into a full-fledged fire. Once the fire was blazing, the real work began. Blacksmiths didn't have time for leisurely breakfasts or slow, contemplative mornings. The day's tasks had already been planned out, often the night before, and the blacksmith had to hit the ground running. Orders from local villagers, farmers, knights, and merchants piled up, each with its own deadline, each with its own level of importance. The day's work varied, but it often started with horseshoes. Horseshoes were in constant demand, especially during times of war or heavy travel. A single horse might need a new set of shoes every few weeks, and each shoe had to be custom fitted, shaped to the precise curve of the horse's hoof. The blacksmith would select a piece of iron, toss it into the fire, and wait for it to reach the right temperature. Timing was crucial. If the iron was too cool, it wouldn't bend properly. If it was too hot, it could crack or warp. The blacksmith hovered over the flames, his eyes fixed on the glowing metal, watching for the telltale signs that it was ready to be worked. When the iron reached the desired color, a bright cherry-red glow, he pulled it from the fire with a pair of heavy tongs. Now came the hammering. Each blow had to be perfectly placed, each strike calculated to shape the metal without weakening it. The apprentice, if he was lucky, was allowed to swing the smaller hammer, following the master's lead, striking where the master pointed, mimicking the master's rhythm. The sound of hammer striking iron filled the forge, a relentless, deafening clang that echoed through the village, a harsh, metallic symphony that played from sunrise to sunset. While the master worked on horseshoes, the apprentice might be tasked with simpler, less glamorous items, nails, hooks, and hinges. These were small, repetitive tasks that required little skill but a great deal of endurance. The apprentice would heat a thin rod of iron, hammer it into a point, twist it with pliers, and then dunk it into the water barrel to cool. Again and again, for hours at a time, until his arms felt like lead and his back screamed in pain. Lunchtime was a brief and often unsatisfying affair. The forge never stopped, not even for meals. The apprentice would wolf down a piece of stale bread or a bowl of thin porridge while the master barked orders and the fire continued to roar. There was no time to sit, no time to rest, no time to relax. The work had to continue, and the forge had to stay hot. Afternoons were often reserved for more complex projects, repairing a broken plowshare, crafting a new sword, or forging a set of armor. These tasks required precision and focus. Every angle had to be exact, every measurement perfect. Mistakes weren't just inconvenient, they were costly. Iron was expensive, and a botched piece meant lost time and wasted material. For weapons, the stakes were even higher. A sword that snapped in battle could mean the death of the knight wielding it. The blacksmith knew this, and every time he swung the hammer, he felt the weight of that responsibility. Every strike was a prayer, every clang a promise. To himself, to his customer, to the gods of the forge, that the weapon he was forging would hold strong when it mattered most. The apprentice, meanwhile, continued his menial tasks, pumping the bellows, hauling water, sweeping the floor. His hands were blistered and calloused, his muscles exhausted, his mind numb with fatigue. The heat from the forge was suffocating, and the air was thick with smoke and ash. Sweat dripped from his brow stinging his eyes and mingling with the soot that coated his skin. By the time the sun began to set, the forge was a mess. Ash piled up in the corners, tools lay scattered across the workbench, and the floor was littered with scraps of iron and pools of dirty water. But the day wasn't over yet. Before the blacksmith could close up shop, everything had to be cleaned and organized. The tools had to be sharpened and oiled, the floor swept and scrubbed, the fire dampened but not completely extinguished. Only after all this was done could the blacksmith and his apprentice finally leave the forge. But even then, the work wasn't truly finished. At home, the blacksmith still had to go over the day's orders, plan out the next day's tasks, and inspect the work for quality and flaws. And the apprentice? He collapsed onto his straw mat, too tired to think, too sore to sleep, his mind haunted by the endless rhythm of the hammer striking iron, a sound that echoed through his dreams long after the forge had gone cold. Life as a medieval blacksmith wasn't just about physical labor. It was also about dealing with demanding and often unpredictable customers. The blacksmith was the backbone of the village economy, relied upon for everything from simple nails and horseshoes to intricate locks and deadly weapons. But with that demand came an endless stream of customers, each with their own expectations, complaints, and urgent requests. First, there were the farmers. Farmers relied heavily on their tools, plowshares, hoes, scythes, and axes. These were the items that kept their crops growing and their livelihoods intact. When a plowshare cracked or a hoe head snapped, they couldn't afford to wait days or weeks for a repair. They needed it fixed immediately. They would arrive at the forge, red-faced and sweating, waving the broken tool like a weapon, demanding that the blacksmith drop everything and get to work. For the blacksmith, this presented a dilemma. If he stopped to repair the plowshare, he would fall behind on the horseshoes he was already working on. But if he refused, he risked angering a vital customer, one who might spread word of his laziness to the rest of the village. And so, he would set aside his current work, assess the damage to the plowshare, and begin the tedious process of reshaping and reforging the iron. Then there were the knights and soldiers. These were the most dangerous customers of all. Unlike farmers, who might grumble and complain, knights wielded swords and carried the authority of the local lord. If a knight demanded a new sword or a fresh set of armor, the blacksmith had little choice but to comply, no matter how busy he was. Forging a sword was no simple task. The blacksmith had to select the right metal, heat it to the perfect temperature, and hammer it into shape with methodical precision. A sword couldn't be rushed, but knights were impatient. They would stand by the forge, arms crossed, watching every move, demanding updates, insisting that their weapon be finished before sundown. Some would criticize the blacksmith's technique, offering unsolicited advice, or comparing him to the great blacksmith in the neighboring village who, supposedly, could craft a perfect blade in half the time. And then there were the merchants. Merchants were a different kind of demanding. They didn't care so much about quality as they did about price. They would haggle, argue, and attempt to undercut the blacksmith at every turn. They wanted bulk orders, nails by the dozen, hinges by the 100, but they wanted them cheap, fast, and flawless. If the blacksmith refused to lower his prices, the merchant would threaten to take his business elsewhere, perhaps to a rival blacksmith or, worse, to a distant city where goods were imported in bulk. Women also visited the forge, though their needs were different. They came with broken pots and pans, cracked cauldrons, bent knives, and shattered scissors. They would stand by the doorway, clutching their children, waiting silently while the blacksmith hammered away at more important tasks. For the blacksmith, these requests were often a nuisance, small, finicky repairs that paid little and took up valuable time. But refusing them outright wasn't an option. Every customer, no matter how insignificant, was a potential source of gossip, and the blacksmith couldn't afford to make enemies. Children too would wander into the forge, drawn by the spectacle of the roaring fire and the clanging hammer. They would stare wide-eyed as the blacksmith pulled red-hot iron from the flames, gasping at the sight of sparks flying through the air. Some were sent by their parents to pick up an order. Others were simply there to gawk, to ask a million questions, to beg for a tiny nail or a scrap of iron as a keepsake. The blacksmith had little patience for them, swatting them away like flies. But some persisted, returning day after day until they became a familiar, if irritating, presence. But the most difficult customers were the lords and noblemen. These men rarely came to the forge themselves. They sent servants or messengers in their stead, bearing long lists of demands, armor for their guards, swords for their soldiers, ornate gates for their estates. These orders were complex and time-consuming, and the blacksmith had to prioritize them above all else. Failing to complete a nobleman's order on time could mean punishment, fines, or even imprisonment. And yet, for all their demands, noblemen often refused to pay fair prices. They assumed their status entitled them to a discount, or that the blacksmith should be honored to work for them. They might promise future patronage in exchange for present work, or offer payment in the form of favors and vague assurances rather than actual coin. The blacksmith, caught between wanting to maintain his reputation and needing to feed his family, was often forced to accept these unfavorable terms. But the worst part of dealing with customers wasn't their demands or their complaints. It was the sheer unpredictability of it all. One day, the blacksmith might be inundated with urgent orders, forced to work from dawn to midnight without a moment's rest. The next day, the forge might stand empty, the anvil cold, the fire burning low, as villagers passed by without so much as a glance. There was no consistency, no security, no guarantee that today's work would lead to tomorrow's meal. The blacksmith's income depended entirely on the whims of the village, on the weather, on the harvest, on the number of horses that went lame or plows that broke. If it was a good year with plenty of work and plenty of coin, the blacksmith might earn enough to buy a second set of tools, or to repair the leaking roof over his forge. If it was a bad year, with crop failures, war, or plague, he might find himself struggling to buy enough charcoal to keep the fire burning. And yet, no matter how difficult the customers, no matter how unreasonable their demands, the blacksmith had to maintain a veneer of patience and professionalism. A single angry outburst, a single refusal, a single misstep could ruin his reputation and cost him his livelihood. The blacksmith's life was one of constant negotiation, a delicate dance of strength and submission, power and patience, fire and steel. Medieval blacksmiths were bound by strict social hierarchies and guild structures that dictated not only how they worked, but also how much they earned, what they could produce, and even where they could sell their goods. In this rigid system, the blacksmith was caught in a web of obligations and expectations, constantly walking a tightrope between serving the powerful and struggling to maintain his own autonomy. The guild system was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, guilds offered some level of protection. They regulated prices, set quality standards, and provided a network of support for blacksmiths in times of need. Membership in a guild meant that a blacksmith had some degree of legitimacy and a stable customer base. It also meant that he could charge standardized prices, reducing the risk of being undercut by competitors. But guilds were also restrictive. They enforced strict rules about who could practice the trade, what materials could be used, and even what designs could be produced. Blacksmiths were not free to innovate or experiment without permission from the guildmasters, who controlled the flow of knowledge and materials. If a blacksmith dared to step outside these boundaries, he risked severe punishment, fines, confiscation of goods, or even expulsion from the guild. And without the protection of the guild, a blacksmith was as good as ruined. Becoming a member of a guild was no easy feat. It started with a long, grueling apprenticeship, which could last anywhere from 5 to 10 years. During this time, the apprentice was little more than a servant, bound to his master by a contract that often involved little or no pay. The apprentice worked from dawn to dusk, learning the basics of the trade while performing the most menial and exhausting tasks: hauling water, pumping the bellows, sweeping the forge, fetching tools. Only after years of backbreaking labour would the apprentice be allowed to produce his own work, usually a masterpiece that would be presented to the guild for evaluation. This masterpiece had to demonstrate not only technical skill, but also creativity and craftsmanship. The standards were incredibly high, and many apprentices failed to meet them, remaining apprentices indefinitely or being forced to seek work in another village. If the apprentice passed, he became a journeyman, a step up but still far from true independence. Journeymen travelled from town to town, working under other masters for a wage, but they could not open their own forge or sell their own goods independently. They remained under the watchful eye of the guild, bound by its rules and subjected to its discipline. Only a select few journeymen ever managed to rise to the rank of master blacksmith. To do so, they had to save enough money to open their own forge, pay the hefty guild fees, and produce another masterpiece to prove their worth. Even then, the guild could reject their application, forcing them to continue as a journeyman or seek work elsewhere. For those who did manage to become masters, the rewards were mixed. They gained the right to open a forge, take on apprentices, and sell goods under their own name. But they were also bound by guild regulations that dictated how much they could charge, how many apprentices they could take on, and even how many hours they could work. The guild took a cut of every sale, and failing to pay dues could result in fines or expulsion. Moreover, masters were required to participate in guild activities, attend meetings, and contribute to guild projects. This took time away from the forge, cutting into their already limited earnings. And the guild itself was rife with politics and rivalries. Older, established masters often resented younger newcomers, seeing them as threats to their business. They would band together to undercut prices, spread rumours, or even sabotage a rival's work. The blacksmith was also beholden to the local lord or landowner, who wielded enormous power over the village economy. The lord could demand work at a moment's notice, insist on discounts, or refuse to pay altogether, citing taxes or fees owed to the estate. Blacksmiths had little recourse against such exploitation. Refusing a lord's request could lead to eviction, imprisonment, or worse. In times of war, the demands became even more intense. Lords required weapons, armor, horseshoes, and other essential supplies, all of which had to be produced quickly and at a moment's notice. Blacksmiths worked around the clock, hammering out swords, spears, and shields, all while trying to keep up with their regular orders. The pressure was immense, and the consequences of failure were dire. If a sword snapped in battle, or a horseshoe came loose during a skirmish, the blacksmith could be blamed, fined, or even imprisoned. Beyond the guild and the lord, the blacksmith was also subject to the whims of the church. The church exerted significant influence over medieval life, and blacksmiths were not exempt from its reach. During certain religious festivals, blacksmiths were required to close their forges, attend mass, and contribute a portion of their earnings to the church. Failure to comply could result in excommunication, effectively cutting the blacksmith off from his community and his customer base. Moreover, the church kept a close eye on the types of work being produced. Weapons were a sensitive subject, as the church preached peace while the lords demanded arms. Blacksmiths who forged weapons could be accused of contributing to violence or aiding enemies of the church. Some blacksmiths were even suspected of using their skills for sorcery or witchcraft, particularly if they were seen working late at night or producing unusually intricate designs. For female blacksmiths, the restrictions were even harsher. While rare, some women did work as blacksmiths, either as widows taking over their husbands' forges or as daughters apprenticed to their fathers, but they faced intense scrutiny and prejudice. Many guilds outright banned women from joining, and those who did manage to practice the trade were often viewed with suspicion, accused of being unfeminine or practicing dark arts. All of these pressures, the guild, the lord, the church, the marketplace, combined to create a suffocating web of obligations that left the blacksmith with little room to breathe, let alone thrive. Every coin earned was split a dozen ways. Every hour of work was regulated. Every piece of iron was scrutinized for flaws. The blacksmith's life was a constant balancing act, juggling demands from powerful patrons, competing with rival craftsmen, and struggling to keep the forge burning through feast and famine alike. The forge itself was a place of intense, relentless heat, a hellish, claustrophobic environment where flames roared, sparks flew, and the air hung heavy with smoke and the pungent scent of burning charcoal. The blacksmith's workshop was a simple, sturdy structure, usually constructed from stone or timber, with a high, sloping roof to accommodate the billowing smoke. At the heart of the forge was the hearth, a brick or stone enclosure where the fire blazed day and night. This fire was the very soul of the blacksmith's work, and keeping it at the right temperature was an art form in itself. The fire had to be hot enough to soften iron, but not so hot that it caused the metal to become brittle or lose its integrity. Too cold, and the iron wouldn't budge under the hammer. Too hot, and it could melt or crack. The fuel used in the forge was typically charcoal, painstakingly made by burning wood in low oxygen conditions. This process was labor-intensive and time-consuming, and producing enough charcoal to keep the fire burning throughout the day required constant effort. The blacksmith or his apprentice had to haul heavy sacks of charcoal, shovel it into the hearth, and stoke the flames until they roared with the fierce, consuming heat necessary to soften iron. But controlling that heat was no simple task. The blacksmith relied on a bellows, a large leather and wood contraption that pumped air into the fire to increase its temperature. The bellows was a crude but essential tool, and operating it was exhausting, back-breaking work. The apprentice, often a boy as young as 12, would spend hours pumping the bellows, his arms and legs straining with the effort, sweat pouring down his face as the fire crackled and spat inches from his body. The heat was unbearable. Even in the depths of winter, the forge was a sweltering inferno. In summer, it became a nightmarish oven, with temperatures soaring well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The blacksmith and his apprentice worked shirtless, their skins slick with sweat, their faces flushed and blistered from the constant exposure to the flames. The heat dried out their skin, cracked their lips, and left them constantly parched, gulping down water whenever they could. But the fire wasn't the only source of danger. Sparks flew with every strike of the hammer, tiny, burning embers that could sear flesh in an instant. The blacksmith's arms and chest were crisscrossed with scars, old burns from errant sparks, accidental touches of red-hot metal, or splashes of molten slag. The apprentice, less experienced and more prone to mistakes, bore even more scars, his hands raw and blistered, his fingers stiff and aching. Despite the heat, the forge itself was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the glow of the fire. Shadows danced across the walls, twisted and stretched by the flickering flames, creating an eerie, almost otherworldly atmosphere. The blacksmith had to work by feel as much as by sight, gauging the temperature of the metal by its color. Dull red for warm, cherry red for workable, yellow for dangerously hot. Next to the hearth stood the anvil, a heavy, solid block of iron mounted on a sturdy wooden base. The anvil was the blacksmith's primary workstation, its surface pitted and scarred from years of relentless hammering. Each blow of the hammer sent a shockwave up the blacksmith's arm, jarring his shoulder, vibrating through his bones. The constant pounding took a toll, leaving his muscles knotted and his joints aching. But the anvil was more than just a work surface. It was a tool in its own right. The blacksmith used its various surfaces to shape, bend, and flatten the iron, moving the metal from the flat face to the rounded horn to the sharp-edged step as needed. The anvil was the center of his world, the stage upon which every piece of iron was transformed into something useful or deadly. Beside the anvil hung an array of hammers, each with a specific purpose. There was the sledgehammer for heavy blows, the cross-peen hammer for shaping curves, the ball-peen hammer for rounding edges, and the finishing hammer for smoothing surfaces. Each hammer varied in weight and shape, and the blacksmith had to know exactly when and how to use each one, switching between them with practice, speed, and precision. On a nearby workbench lay the other essential tools: tongs of every size and shape, chisels for cutting, punches for making holes, files for smoothing edges. Each tool had its place, and woe to the apprentice who failed to put a tool back where it belonged. Misplacing a chisel or a pair of tongs could waste precious time, and in the forge, time was money. Then there was the quenching barrel, a large wooden tub filled with water or oil. After the iron was shaped, it was plunged into the barrel to cool rapidly. This process, known as quenching, was fraught with danger. If the metal was too hot when it hit the water, it could crack or shatter. If the water was too cold, it could cause the metal to warp. And if the blacksmith wasn't careful, the steam could scald his face or hands, leaving burns that took weeks to heal. The forge was also filled with noise, a deafening cacophony of hissing steam, crackling flames, and the relentless clang of hammer-striking iron. The sound was so loud and constant that many blacksmiths suffered from partial deafness, their hearing dulled by years of exposure to the metallic din. Conversations had to be shouted to be heard, and apprentices learned quickly to read their master's lips or interpret his gestures amid the clamor. The smells were equally intense. A pungent, overpowering blend of burning charcoal, hot metal, and sweat. The forge reeked of sulfur and smoke, a scent that clung to the blacksmith's clothes, hair, and skin long after the workday ended. Even at home, sitting down to supper, he could still taste the bitter tang of charcoal in his mouth, still feel the heat of the fire radiating from his skin. But for all its discomforts, the forge was also a place of transformation, a crucible where raw, unyielding iron was shaped into tools and weapons, each piece hammered, bent, and tempered into something new. It was a place where the blacksmith wielded power, however fleeting, a power over metal, over fire, over the very shape of things. And yet, that power came at a cost. The forge demanded everything: the blacksmith's strength, his stamina, his very health. The constant exposure to heat left him dehydrated and exhausted. The repetitive hammering strained his muscles and wore down his joints. The smoke and ash filled his lungs, leading to chronic coughs and respiratory issues. And the burns, oh, the burns. Red, blistering welts that stung and festered, seeping pus, refusing to heal. In the end, the forge was both a prison and a sanctuary, a place where the blacksmith could exert his skill, demonstrate his strength, and produce objects of value. But it was also a place of unrelenting toil, where the fire never went out, the hammer never stopped swinging, and the blacksmith's body paid the price for every horseshoe, every sword, every nail. The process of transforming raw iron into usable tools or weapons was a laborious and intricate art, requiring skill, strength, and relentless patience. It all began with sourcing the iron itself, a task that was far from straightforward in the medieval world. Iron was not simply lying around for the taking. It had to be mined, smelted, and refined before it could even reach the blacksmith's hands. Mining was a brutal, dangerous job, often carried out by peasants or indentured workers who hacked away at the earth with primitive tools, digging through rock and soil to extract chunks of iron ore. The work was grueling, and cave-ins, collapses, and toxic fumes were common hazards. Once the ore was extracted, it was taken to a bloomery or a blast furnace, where it was subjected to intense heat to separate the iron from impurities. This process, known as smelting, was a delicate balancing act. Too little heat, and the iron would remain bound to the slag. Too much heat, and the iron could become too brittle to work with. The resulting product was a bloom, a spongy mass of semi-molten iron mixed with slag that had to be further refined before it could be forged. By the time the iron reached the blacksmith, it was in the form of bars or ingots, solid, unyielding chunks of metal that required considerable force to shape. The blacksmith would first assess the iron, examining its grain, texture, and hardness. Not all iron was created equal. Some batches contained more impurities than others, making them less suitable for delicate work or fine weaponry. Poor quality iron could crack or shatter under the hammer, wasting hours of labor. Once the blacksmith had selected the appropriate piece of iron, he would place it in the forge, stoking the fire until the metal glowed a bright, angry red. This was the first stage of the forging process, heating the iron to a malleable state without melting it completely. Achieving the correct temperature was a skill that took years to master. If the iron was too cool, it would resist the hammer's blows. Too hot, and it could burn, losing its integrity and becoming brittle. As the iron heated, the blacksmith prepared his tools, a selection of hammers, tongs, chisels, and punches, each designed for a specific purpose. The blacksmith had to work quickly. Once the iron was removed from the fire, it began to cool rapidly, hardening within minutes. Every strike of the hammer had to be precise, deliberate, and perfectly timed. The blacksmith would lift the hammer high, bringing it down with a sharp, resounding clang that echoed through the forge. With each blow, the iron changed shape, gradually transforming from a shapeless bar into a recognizable form. A horseshoe, a sword blade, a plowshare, all emerged under the relentless pounding of the hammer. But the process was far from straightforward. The blacksmith had to constantly reheat the iron, returning it to the fire whenever it grew too cool to work effectively. This cycle of heating, hammering, and reheating was exhausting. The blacksmith's arms ached from the strain, his muscles trembling with every swing. The heat from the forge pressed down like a suffocating blanket. Sweat streaming down his face, blurring his vision. The rhythm of the hammer blows was hypnotic, almost trance-like. The clang, 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 a ceaseless, bone-rattling beat that drummed through the blacksmith's entire body. But the work was not merely a matter of brute strength. It required an almost surgical precision. The blacksmith had to judge the thickness of the metal, the curve of a blade, the angle of a horseshoe, all by sight and feel alone. There were no precise measurements, no modern tools to assist. Every stroke of the hammer was a calculated risk. One wrong move, and hours of work could be ruined in an instant. Once the iron had been shaped, it was time for quenching, a process that involved plunging the hot metal into a barrel of water or oil to cool it rapidly. This sudden temperature change caused the iron to harden, locking its shape into place. But quenching was a dangerous, unpredictable step. If the metal was too hot when it hit the water, it could crack, warp, or even explode, sending shards of iron flying across the forge. If the quenching medium was too cold, the iron could become too brittle, shattering under pressure. After quenching, the blacksmith would inspect the metal for flaws, cracks, bubbles, uneven surfaces. Any imperfection had to be corrected immediately. This often meant reheating the iron, hammering out the flaws, and quenching it again, a painstaking process that could take hours or even days, depending on the complexity of the piece. Once the iron was properly hardened, the blacksmith moved on to tempering, a second heating process, but at a lower temperature. Tempering was essential for balancing the metal's hardness and flexibility. Without tempering, the iron would be too brittle to withstand heavy use, snapping under pressure or chipping at the edges. The blacksmith would place the iron back in the fire, watching closely as the metal changed color from a dark, dull gray to a glowing, straw-colored yellow. Each color indicated a specific temperature, and each temperature affected the metal's properties in different ways. A pale yellow meant the metal was soft and pliable. A dark blue meant it was hard but brittle. The blacksmith had to find the perfect balance, pulling the iron from the fire at just the right moment. Finally, the blacksmith moved on to finishing, smoothing the surface, sharpening edges, adding decorative elements. This stage required a lighter touch, using smaller hammers, files, and polishing stones to refine the piece. Every detail mattered. The curve of a blade, the alignment of a horseshoe's nails, the pattern of a decorative scroll. A single, misaligned strike could mar the surface, requiring more filing, more polishing, more hours of painstaking labor. But even when the piece was finished, the work was not over. The blacksmith had to ensure that it met the client's specifications, that it was balanced, strong, and fit for purpose. A poorly made sword could break in battle, a misshapen horseshoe could lame a horse, a flawed plowshare could snap under pressure. If the piece passed inspection, it was ready for delivery. But if not, the blacksmith would have to start all over again, melting down the iron, reheating the forge, and hammering away until it was right. And all the while, the forge fire never went out. It burned day and night, consuming mountains of charcoal, filling the air with smoke and soot. The blacksmith's eyes were bloodshot from the constant glare, his lungs heavy with the acrid scent of burning wood. His hands were blackened with soot, his arms sore and aching, his skin seared with burns that would never fully heal. Yet, despite the grueling labor, the blacksmith had to keep working. Every day brought new orders, new demands, new challenges. The village needed nails for a new barn. A knight needed a sword repaired. A farmer needed his plough reshod. There was no end to the work, no respite from the heat, no escape from the forge. In the medieval village, the blacksmith was not just a craftsman. He was a lifeline. Nearly every aspect of daily life relied on ironwork, and without it, the entire community would grind to a halt. The blacksmith was responsible for producing tools, weapons, household items, agricultural implements, and even simple nails, each of which required specific skills, techniques, and endless labor. The demand for tools was relentless. Farmers needed plowshares, hoes, sickles, and scythes, all of which had to be sturdy enough to withstand the unforgiving soil and backbreaking work. If a plowshare snapped in the middle of the planting season, it could mean the difference between a bountiful harvest and a year of hunger. The blacksmith had to ensure that each tool was not only well forged but properly tempered, capable of withstanding hours of relentless digging and hacking without bending, chipping, or breaking. Creating a plowshare was an especially arduous task. It wasn't just a flat piece of iron. It had to be curved, angled, and sharpened precisely to cut through the earth. The blacksmith had to heat a large chunk of iron until it glowed a furious yellow, then hammer it repeatedly over the anvil, flattening and shaping it into the desired form. The iron had to be thick enough to endure repeated impact against stones and roots, yet thin enough to maintain a sharp, cutting edge. But plowshares were just the beginning. The blacksmith was also responsible for making the hoes used to till the soil, the scythes for harvesting grain, the sickles for cutting grass, and the axes for chopping wood. Each tool required different techniques, different hammer strikes, and different tempering methods. A hoe, for instance, needed a wide, flat blade that could break through compacted soil. The blacksmith would hammer it out from a rectangular iron bar, then bend and curve it to form the perfect angle for digging. A scythe, on the other hand, required a long, curved blade that could sweep through tall grasses and crops without snagging or snapping. Forging a scythe blade was a particularly delicate task, as the metal had to be thin enough to maintain a razor-sharp edge, but resilient enough to endure constant use. The blacksmith would spend hours heating, hammering, and tempering the blade, all the while balancing the weight so that the scythe wouldn't be too heavy for the farmer to wield effectively. Axes presented their own unique challenges. An axe blade had to be thick and heavy, capable of splitting logs with a single swing, but it also had to be balanced, with a sharp, beveled edge that wouldn't chip or dull too quickly. The blacksmith would start by shaping the iron into a wedge, then refine the edge with a series of increasingly precise hammer strikes. The blade would then be quenched and tempered, a nerve-wracking process that required careful timing to prevent warping or cracking. But it wasn't just agricultural tools that kept the blacksmith busy. Household items were also essential, from cooking pots and kettles to hinges, door latches, and fireplace pokers. Each item had to be crafted with precision, yet none were as simple as they seemed. Take a simple iron pot, for example. The blacksmith had to shape a flat sheet of iron into a perfectly rounded basin, hammering it evenly to ensure that the walls were thick enough to withstand heat, but thin enough to avoid weighing too much. After shaping the basin, the blacksmith would add handles, riveting them to the sides with iron pins that had to be heated, hammered flat, and then cooled to lock them in place. Every rivet required multiple strikes of the hammer, each timed to drive the pin through the hole without bending or breaking it. If even one rivet failed, the entire pot could fall apart, spilling hot contents and potentially burning the owner. Nails were another critical yet deceptively simple product. A blacksmith might produce hundreds of nails in a single day, each one requiring individual attention. First, the iron rod was heated, then hammered into a long, thin shaft. The shaft was then placed over a special nail-heading tool, where the blacksmith would flatten the top to form a head. The entire process took mere seconds, but the work was repetitive and mind-numbingly tedious. In times of conflict, the demand for weapons surged, transforming the blacksmith's role from that of a simple tradesman to a crucial military supplier. Swords, spears, maces, and arrowheads all had to be produced quickly and in large quantities. Forging a sword was a complex, multi-step process involving hours of intense labor. The blacksmith had to select the finest iron, heat it to the perfect temperature, and hammer it into a long, tapered blade. Creating the blade's edge was an art in itself. The blacksmith would use a file to smooth and sharpen the blade, then polish it to a mirror-like finish. After quenching and tempering, the blade was affixed to a hilt, a process that required more riveting and precise hammerwork. Each sword had to be perfectly balanced, its weight evenly distributed to ensure that the wielder could swing it effectively in battle. And it wasn't just offensive weapons that demanded the blacksmith's skill. Defensive armor was equally essential. Forging a helmet, for instance, involved shaping a single sheet of iron into a dome, then adding cheek guards, a nasal guard, and a reinforced rim. Each piece had to fit snugly without hindering the soldier's vision or movement. Chainmail was another time-consuming endeavor. Each ring had to be individually forged, flattened, and riveted. A single shirt of chainmail could contain thousands of rings, requiring days, if not weeks, of painstaking labor to complete. The blacksmith or his apprentice would sit hunched over the workbench, eyes straining, fingers blistered, as they threaded and closed ring after ring. Even when war was not raging, the demand for weapons never truly ceased. The village had to be ready to defend itself from bandits, raiders, or rival lords. Knights required regular maintenance for their armor, horses needed shoes, and castle gates needed reinforcing. Each job demanded the blacksmith's expertise, keeping him perpetually busy, hammering away in the sweltering heat of the forge. Then there were the miscellaneous items: candlestick holders, keys, padlocks, horseshoe nails, hinges, and chain links. Each item, no matter how small, required its own set of tools and techniques. A simple key, for instance, had to be cut with exact precision to fit its corresponding lock. The blacksmith would use a chisel to carve the notches, testing and retesting the key to ensure that it turned smoothly without jamming. All of this work, the endless hammering, shaping, filing, and tempering, took its toll. The blacksmith's hands were calloused and swollen, his back hunched from hours of leaning over the anvil, his lungs thick with soot and ash. Yet despite the grueling labor, the blacksmith remained indispensable to the village, a vital cog in the machinery of medieval life. The blacksmith's forge was the heart of his operation, a dark, smoky, and sweltering space where iron was transformed from a cold, lifeless metal into objects of practical utility and deadly force. The forge was a place of relentless heat, roaring flames, and the deafening clang of hammer-striking metal. It was both a place of creation and destruction, where the blacksmith worked tirelessly to mold iron to his will. In its simplest form, a medieval forge consisted of a fire pit or hearth, a bellows, an anvil, and a workbench. But the forge was more than just a collection of tools. It was an entire ecosystem, each part serving a crucial role in the blacksmith's work. The fire pit was the centerpiece, a stone or brick structure packed with charcoal or coal that could reach temperatures upwards of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 815 degrees C. Maintaining the fire was a skill in itself. The blacksmith couldn't simply light a fire and let it burn. He had to regulate the heat carefully, feeding it with just the right amount of fuel to keep it blazing without burning through his entire stockpile of charcoal. Too little heat, and the iron would refuse to bend. Too much heat, and it could become too soft, losing its structural integrity. Enter the bellows, a massive, lung-like device made of wood, leather, and iron that pumped air into the fire to raise its temperature. The blacksmith, or his apprentice, would work the bellows with a steady, rhythmic motion, forcing air through a metal nozzle and into the flames. Each pull and push of the bellows sent a gust of oxygen into the fire, causing it to flare up in brilliant, orange-yellow bursts. The forge roared like a living beast, its heat searing the air, its flames crackling and spitting as the iron heated to a glowing red. But working the bellows was a grueling, repetitive task. It required strength, stamina, and an unrelenting pace. An apprentice might spend hours each day just pumping the bellows, his arms aching, his back drenched in sweat, his eyes stinging from the acrid smoke. And the work was dangerous. Sparks leaped from the fire, embers flew, and the heat was so intense that a single misstep could result in severe burns, or worse. Once the iron was heated, the blacksmith had to move quickly. Timing was everything. He would grasp the iron with a pair of long-handled tongs, thick, heavy and blackened with soot, lifting it from the heart of the fire and placing it onto the anvil. The anvil was the blacksmith's altar, a solid block of iron or steel that absorbed the impact of each hammer strike. It was typically shaped like a horn, with a flat face for general hammering, a pointed end for shaping curves, and a hardy hole for holding specialized tools. The anvil was more than just a surface for striking. It was a tool in itself, with each section serving a specific purpose. The flat face was used for general shaping, flattening, and smoothing. The horn was used to curve and bend metal, allowing the blacksmith to create rounded shapes like horseshoes or curved blades. The hardy hole held various inserts, such as chisels or punches, that enabled the blacksmith to cut or shape the iron with greater precision. With the iron positioned on the anvil, the blacksmith would pick up his hammer, a hefty, iron-headed tool that varied in size and weight depending on the task. A typical forging hammer weighed anywhere from 2 to 5 pounds, but larger hammers could exceed 10 pounds, requiring immense strength and precision to wield effectively. Every hammer strike was a calculated blow, aimed not just to shape the iron, but to compress its structure, aligning its internal grain for maximum strength. The blacksmith's movements became a kind of rhythm, a ceaseless, hypnotic cadence of clang, clang, clang that echoed through the forge like a war drum. Each strike sent a spray of sparks flying, each blow sending a shock wave through the blacksmith's arms and shoulders. But the hammering wasn't just about brute force. It was an art form, a delicate dance of timing, angle, and pressure. The blacksmith had to know exactly where to strike, how hard, and at what angle. A single misaligned blow could ruin hours of work, bending the iron in the wrong direction or creating a fatal crack that would render the piece useless. To prevent such mistakes, the blacksmith had to develop a keen sense of touch and a razor-sharp eye for detail. He would often run his fingers along the surface of the iron, feeling for imperfections, listening to the sound it made when struck. A dull, thudding sound could indicate a crack or hidden flaw. A sharp, ringing tone meant the metal was solid and well forged. All the while, the fire continued to burn, consuming more and more fuel. The forge had to be maintained constantly, with the blacksmith or his apprentice shoveling fresh charcoal onto the fire, adjusting the bellows, and keeping the flames at a steady roar. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with smoke and ash. The blacksmith's skin glistened with sweat, his clothes clung to his body, and every breath felt like inhaling embers. And then there was the soot. It coated everything, the walls, the tools, the floor, the blacksmith himself. It got into his eyes, his nose, his lungs, turning his skin black and his hair grey with ash. The forge was a filthy, grimy place, and there was no escaping it. Even after hours of work, the blacksmith would be covered in soot, his hands raw and blistered, his back aching from the constant strain of lifting and hammering heavy iron. But despite the filth and exhaustion, the forge remained the blacksmith's domain, a place where he was both creator and destroyer, both artist and labourer. It was a place where raw, unyielding iron was tamed through fire and force, where tools were born and weapons forged, where the village's survival hung on the blacksmith's skill and endurance. The blacksmith's day began long before dawn and often stretched well past sunset. Unlike the modern concept of an 8-hour workday, the medieval blacksmith worked until the job was done, regardless of how long it took. The forge was a place of unrelenting labour, where the constant demands of the village and the unpredictability of life kept the blacksmith and his apprentice toiling for hours on end. Before the sun even peeked over the horizon, the blacksmith would rise from his straw-filled mattress, his muscles sore and stiff from the previous day's exertion. The air inside his small one-room cottage was frigid, the chill biting through the thin walls and settling deep into his bones. There was no time to linger in bed, though. The forge awaited, and so did the pile of unfinished work from the day before. The first task was rekindling the fire. Overnight, the forge fire would have died down to a heap of smouldering embers. The blacksmith would shovel away the cold ash, exposing the still glowing coals beneath. Carefully, he'd add fresh charcoal or coal, using a poker to distribute it evenly across the hearth. Then came the bellows. The apprentice, if he was old enough and strong enough, would begin pumping the bellows, forcing air into the fire until the embers flared to life. The rhythmic huffing and puffing of the bellows echoed through the forge, filling the small space with the sound of breathing flames. The blacksmith watched the fire closely, his eyes narrowed against the blinding glare, waiting for the perfect temperature. The iron wouldn't be ready to work until it glowed a bright, almost yellow-orange, a color that indicated the metal was hot enough to be shaped, but not so hot that it risked burning or crumbling. While the fire roared to life, the blacksmith laid out his tools, hammers, tongs, chisels, and punches, each with its own specific purpose. The tools themselves were well worn and blackened with soot, their handles smoothed by years of use. Each hammer had a different weight and shape, from the broad-faced sledgehammer used for heavy strikes to the smaller, more precise cross-peen hammer for delicate work. The tongs, too, came in various shapes, flat, round, pointed, each designed to grip a specific type of ironwork. Once the forge was hot enough, the real work began. The blacksmith would grasp a raw iron bar with a pair of long-handled tongs, holding it steady as he plunged it into the fire. The iron had to be heated evenly, so he would rotate it slowly, ensuring that every inch absorbed the same amount of heat. This process could take several minutes, during which the blacksmith stood mere inches from the searing flames, sweat pouring down his brow, the skin on his hands and forearms prickling from the intense heat. When the iron reached the right temperature, the blacksmith would pull it from the fire and move swiftly to the anvil. Time was of the essence. The iron would only remain malleable for a short window, and once it began to cool, it would harden, becoming impossible to shape. The blacksmith's strikes had to be swift and precise, each one carefully planned and executed. Hammering was a skill that took years to master. The blacksmith had to strike the iron with enough force to shape it, but not so hard that it deformed the metal. Each blow sent a shower of sparks flying, the sound of metal on metal ringing through the forge like a bell. The blacksmith's muscles strained with each strike, his arms moving in a steady, relentless rhythm, each blow echoing the one before it. As the iron cooled, it lost its malleability, becoming harder and more resistant to shaping. This meant that the blacksmith often had to reheat the metal multiple times during a single job. Every time the iron cooled, it went back into the fire, and every time it came out, the blacksmith had to work quickly, hammering, bending, and shaping before the metal lost its heat. The work was exhausting, repetitive, and physically demanding. The blacksmith's hands blistered and calloused from gripping the hot tongs. His back ached from leaning over the anvil, and his shoulders burned from the constant hammering. But there was no time to rest. Each job had a deadline, whether it was a farmer needing a new plowshare, a knight requiring a fresh set of horseshoes, or a lord demanding a new sword. And then there were the unexpected interruptions, the urgent knocks at the forge door from villagers in desperate need of repairs, a snapped axe handle, a broken sickle, a rusty hinge. Each item had to be fixed immediately, regardless of what the blacksmith was currently working on. Dropping everything to handle these emergencies was part of the job, but it threw off the entire day's schedule, adding even more stress to an already demanding workload. Meals, when they happened, were quick and simple. The blacksmith might gulp down a hunk of stale bread and a bowl of watery pottage, washing it down with a ladle full of ale or weak beer. There was no time for a leisurely meal, and certainly no time to leave the forge. Often, he'd eat standing up, eyes fixed on the fire, waiting for the iron to reach the perfect temperature. The apprentice, if he was old enough, might handle the simpler tasks, working the bellows, fetching tools, or tending to the fire. Apprentices started young, sometimes as early as age 7 or 8, and their days were as grueling as the blacksmith's. They worked from sunup to sundown, learning the trade through observation, repetition, and relentless labor. In exchange, they received food, shelter, and the chance to one day become a master blacksmith themselves. As the day wore on, the forge grew hotter, the air thicker with smoke and ash. The blacksmith's clothes clung to his body, damp with sweat, his hair plastered to his forehead. His lungs burned from inhaling the smoky air. His eyes stung from the constant exposure to the fire's glare. There were no breaks, no rest periods, no escape from the heat. The work continued, hour after hour, each task blending into the next, in an unending cycle of hammering, heating, and shaping. By the time the sun finally set, the blacksmith's body was a mass of aching muscles and throbbing joints. But the work wasn't finished yet. The forge had to be cleaned and organized, tools put away, and the fire dampened to prevent any nighttime accidents. Only then could the blacksmith retire to his meager bed, collapsing onto the straw-stuffed mattress with bones so weary they felt like lead. Yet even in sleep, the work never truly ended. His dreams were filled with the clang of the hammer, the roar of the fire, and the endless, ceaseless rhythm of iron being pounded into shape. And in the morning, he would rise again, shoulders stiff, hands blistered, to do it all over again. The apprentice was the lifeblood of the blacksmith's forge, a boy or young man who worked tirelessly under the master's watchful eye, learning the trade from the ground up. Becoming an apprentice was a rite of passage, a long and arduous journey that could last anywhere from 5 to 7 years. During that time, the apprentice would live in the blacksmith's household, sleeping in a cramped corner of the workshop or a small, drafty room nearby. For many apprentices, the day began before dawn. As the first rays of light crept over the village, the apprentice would already be awake, shivering in the morning chill. His first task was to stoke the forge fire, a job that required patience and skill. He'd carefully rake through the cold ashes, searching for any remaining embers, then add fresh charcoal or coal. Using a poker, he would spread the coals evenly across the hearth, ensuring that the fire would burn consistently throughout the day. Next came the bellows, a massive, heavy apparatus that demanded both strength and endurance. Pumping the bellows was exhausting work, especially for a young boy whose arms were not yet fully developed. The apprentice would stand beside the forge, gripping the wooden handles with both hands, and pull down with all his might. The leather bellows would expand with a low, wheezing groan, and as he pushed upward, a powerful gust of air would rush into the fire, causing the flames to leap and roar. This was the apprentice's first true lesson in blacksmithing, the art of controlling fire. Too much air, and the flames would flare up too quickly, wasting precious fuel. Too little, and the fire would sputter and die. The apprentice had to learn to feel the rhythm, to time each pump of the bellows perfectly, until the fire reached the desired intensity. But pumping the bellows was just the beginning. Once the fire was blazing, the apprentice had to keep it that way for hours on end, all while running back and forth to fetch tools, deliver messages, or assist the master with other tasks. The blacksmith's forge was a chaotic, frenzied place, filled with the clanging of hammers, the crackle of flames, and the acrid stench of burning coal. It was a sensory overload, hot, loud, and utterly exhausting. The apprentice's hands were in constant motion, grabbing tongs, handing over hammers, and holding pieces of iron in place while the blacksmith hammered away. He had to be quick, nimble, and attentive, anticipating the master's needs before they were spoken. If the blacksmith barked, "Bring me the fuller hammer," The apprentice had to know exactly which tool to grab. There was no room for hesitation, no time to second guess. Mistakes were inevitable, of course. The apprentice might hand over the wrong tool or drop a hot piece of iron, sending sparks flying across the workshop floor. If he was lucky, the blacksmith would correct him with a stern word or a withering glare. If he wasn't, he might receive a sharp cuff to the back of the head, a painful but effective reminder to pay closer attention. Discipline in the forge was strict, and there was little tolerance for carelessness. Then there were the burns. The forge was a place of intense heat, and accidents were common. A slip of the tongs could mean a searing burn on the wrist or forearm. An iron rod dropped too quickly might singe the skin through thin woolen sleeves. Apprentices often bore the scars of their work, crisscrossing burns and blisters that told the story of their years in the forge. Some of these wounds would heal over time, but others would leave permanent marks. A badge of honor, in a way, symbolizing the apprentice's dedication to his craft. But it wasn't all punishment and pain. There were moments of genuine learning, flashes of insight when the blacksmith took the time to explain a particular technique or demonstrate the finer points of shaping iron. The apprentice would watch closely, eyes fixed on the master's hands as he swung the hammer with precise, practiced motions. Each strike was a lesson, an opportunity to learn the nuances of force, angle, and rhythm. The blacksmith might let the apprentice practice on small, simple pieces. Perhaps a nail, a small horseshoe, or a crude knife. These were basic projects, meant to teach the apprentice how to hold the tongs properly, how to angle the hammer, and how to judge the temperature of the metal by its color. If the iron was too cool, it would resist shaping, remaining stiff and unyielding. If it was too hot, it would become too soft, losing its structural integrity. Learning to read the metal's temperature by its color, a dull red, a bright orange, a searing yellow, was an essential skill, one that took years to master. As the apprentice grew older and stronger, his responsibilities would increase. He would be allowed to work the anvil more frequently, shaping small tools, sharpening blades, or repairing broken farm implements. But even as his skills improved, he remained under the blacksmith's strict supervision. A single mistake, a cracked horseshoe, a poorly forged knife, could ruin days of work and cost the blacksmith valuable materials. The stakes were high, and the pressure to perform was relentless. The apprentice was also expected to maintain the forge itself. This meant sweeping up the piles of ash and charcoal dust that accumulated throughout the day, oiling the bellows to keep them in working order, and organizing the tools so that they were always within easy reach. The forge was a messy, chaotic place, and keeping it somewhat orderly was a never-ending task. Despite the grueling work, there was a certain camaraderie in the forge, a sense of belonging that came from enduring hardship together. The blacksmith might grumble and shout, but he was also the apprentice's teacher, mentor, and, in many ways, a surrogate father. The two spent nearly every waking hour together, forging not just iron, but a bond of mutual respect and trust. By the end of the day, the apprentice was bone-tired, his hands blackened with soot, his arms aching from pumping the bellows and swinging the hammer. He'd collapse onto his straw mattress, too exhausted to think, his mind filled with the sights and sounds of the forge, the glowing fire, the clang of iron on iron, the hiss of steam as hot metal met cold water. Yet, as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help but dream of the day when he would no longer be an apprentice, when he would stand at his own forge, a master blacksmith in his own right, wielding the hammer with the same effortless skill as the man who taught him. The blacksmith's forge was not just a place of intense labor, it was also a furnace of dangers, a crucible where both iron and men were tested under the relentless pressure of heat and fire. The work was perilous, and injuries were not only common, but expected. Burns, cuts, blisters, and even life-threatening accidents were an ever-present reality in the forge, and the blacksmith had to be constantly vigilant to avoid becoming a casualty of his own craft. The most obvious danger in the forge was, of course, the fire itself. The forge fire roared like a living beast, its flames licking hungrily at anything too close to its maw. A moment's lapse in concentration, a careless step, and the blacksmith could find himself with singed eyebrows or a blistering burn across his forearm. The fire was unpredictable. A sudden gust from the bellows could cause a flare-up, sending flames roaring higher and hotter than expected. Burns ranged from mild to severe, and each left its mark. Minor burns from stray sparks might only leave red, tender spots on the skin, but more serious burns could blister and fester, leading to infections that, in a world without antibiotics, could easily turn deadly. In some cases, the blacksmith's hands bore so many scars that they became a patchwork of hardened, calloused flesh, a grim testament to years of surviving the forge's merciless heat. But the fire wasn't the only source of burns. The metal itself, once heated, became a searing brand capable of inflicting grievous wounds. Hot iron, when pulled from the fire, glowed with an almost hypnotic radiance, its surface shimmering with hues of orange, yellow, and even white. The blacksmith knew that the brighter the glow, the more dangerous the metal. Yet, in the chaos of the forge, it was easy to lose track of which pieces were hot and which were cool. A single careless touch was enough to sear flesh to the bone, leaving behind raw, blistered skin that took weeks to heal. Even the tools themselves posed a risk. The blacksmith wielded a variety of hammers, each with its own specific purpose, and each capable of delivering devastating blows. A missed strike could send the hammer crashing down onto his own hand, crushing bones and tearing flesh. And the tongs, while designed to hold hot metal securely, could also become dangerously hot themselves, transferring heat to the blacksmith's hands and causing severe burns if handled carelessly. Perhaps even more dangerous than the heat was the sheer weight of the iron. Working with metal meant hefting heavy bars, rods, and plates, each of which could weigh dozens of pounds. Dropping a hot iron bar onto one's foot could break bones and leave a nasty burn. An improperly secured piece of metal could slip from the anvil, crashing to the ground with enough force to shatter a toe. And then there was the anvil itself, a hulking, immovable mass of iron that could easily crush a hand or foot if struck at the wrong angle. The air inside the forge was another silent threat. The fire consumed vast quantities of oxygen, filling the room with thick, smoky air that was heavy with the acrid scent of burning coal. The blacksmith breathed in this smoke day after day, his lungs growing thick with soot and ash. Prolonged exposure to these fumes could lead to chronic respiratory problems, a slow, suffocating decline that left the blacksmith coughing up blackened phlegm and gasping for breath. And then there was the risk of inhaling metal dust. As the blacksmith hammered and ground down iron, tiny particles of metal filled the air, a fine, glittering mist that settled into his lungs. Over time, these metal shavings could accumulate, causing debilitating lung diseases that left the blacksmith wheezing and short of breath. There was no way to protect oneself from this invisible danger. No masks, no ventilation systems, just the relentless, suffocating air of the forge. Beyond the burns, the crushing injuries, and the poisoned air, there was also the constant threat of catastrophic accidents. The forge was a place of intense activity, where iron rods were heated to blistering temperatures, swung through the air, and pounded relentlessly with heavy hammers. One misplaced step, one moment of inattention, and a blacksmith could find himself struck by a flying shard of hot metal or a hammer swung too wide. The apprentice, too, faced constant danger. Young and inexperienced, He was often the one tasked with the riskiest jobs, holding hot metal in place, pumping the bellows dangerously close to the roaring fire, or running from one side of the forge to the other with glowing iron rods in hand. Apprentices learned quickly that a single mistake could mean serious injury, or worse. And then there were the accidents that no one could predict. A crack in the anvil, a weakened hammerhead, a forge fire that blazed out of control. Any of these could lead to disaster. If the anvil's surface was compromised, it could send a hammer rebounding dangerously toward the blacksmith's face. If a hammerhead snapped off its handle, it could fly across the room like a deadly missile. If the fire leapt too high, it could set the entire workshop ablaze, trapping the blacksmith and his apprentice in a furnace of their own making. But despite all these dangers, the blacksmith carried on. Injuries were simply part of the job, accepted as inevitable and endured with stoic resolve. A blacksmith with a singed hand or a bruised foot was still expected to work. His pain swallowed down and ignored as he continued hammering away at the iron. There were no sick days in the forge, no time to rest and recover. The work had to go on, no matter the cost. And so, each day, the blacksmith rose to face the fire once more, his body a mass of scars and blisters, his lungs thick with smoke, his hands calloused and blackened by the relentless heat. He knew the risks, knew that each strike of the hammer could be his last. But the forge was his life, his livelihood, and the only place he knew. For all the danger and discomfort of the forge, the blacksmith's life was not without its rewards. In the medieval village, the blacksmith held a position of considerable importance, a role that placed him at the very heart of the community. His skill with hammer and anvil was not just a craft. It was a vital service that sustained the daily life of the village. Without the blacksmith, farmers had no tools, knights had no swords, and horses had no shoes. In a world where metal was as valuable as gold, the blacksmith was both artisan and essential worker, a man whose labor kept the wheels of medieval society turning. The work of the blacksmith touched nearly every aspect of village life. From dawn to dusk, his forge was a hive of activity, a place where iron was transformed into everything from nails and horseshoes to plowshares and weapons. Farmers came to him with broken plows and dull scythes, tools that needed repairing or sharpening before the next planting season. Hunters brought him knives to be honed and traps to be mended. Even the clergy relied on the blacksmith for church bells, candle holders, and wrought iron gates. One of the most common and vital tasks for any blacksmith was the making and fitting of horseshoes. In a time when horses were the primary mode of transportation and the backbone of agricultural labor, keeping them properly shod was of paramount importance. The blacksmith was, in effect, the medieval equivalent of a mechanic, responsible for ensuring that the village's engines, its horses, remained in working order. Shoemaking was a delicate and demanding process. First, the blacksmith would measure the horse's hoof, a task that required not only precision, but also a steady hand and a calm demeanor. Horses, after all, were unpredictable creatures, capable of kicking with deadly force if spooked or startled. The blacksmith had to work quickly and confidently, pressing the hot horseshoe against the hoof to create a perfect fit. The acrid scent of burning hoof filled the air, a sharp, unmistakable odor that lingered long after the shoe was set. But the blacksmith's skill extended far beyond mere shoeing. In an age when warfare was a constant threat, the demand for weapons was ever present. The village blacksmith was responsible for producing swords, axes, and spears, each of which required precise craftsmanship and meticulous attention to detail. Making a sword, for instance, was a lengthy and arduous process that involved multiple stages of heating, hammering, quenching, and tempering. The blacksmith would begin by selecting a suitable piece of iron or steel, one that could withstand the rigors of battle without snapping or bending. He would then heat the metal in the forge until it was white hot, pounding it flat with a series of rhythmic, measured blows. Each strike of the hammer was an exercise in controlled force, shaping the blade inch by inch until it took on the desired form. Once the basic shape was achieved, the blacksmith would turn his attention to the finer details, the beveling of the edges, the shaping of the point, and the crafting of the hilt and guard. Every aspect of the weapon had to be balanced and precise, for a poorly forged blade was not only ineffective in combat, but also a danger to its wielder. The blacksmith's reputation often hinged on the quality of his weapons, and a single flawed sword could ruin his standing in the village. But weapons and tools were only part of the blacksmith's repertoire. He was also responsible for creating household items, everything from pots and pans to hinges and locks. These seemingly mundane objects required a surprising level of skill and artistry, for each piece had to be strong enough to endure daily use, yet finely wrought enough to function smoothly. A well-made lock, for instance, was a mark of prestige and security, a symbol of the blacksmith's skill in both design and function. The blacksmith's forge was also a gathering place for the village, a sort of unofficial meeting hall where people came not only to commission work, but also to exchange news, gossip, and the latest rumors. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil echoed throughout the village, a constant, familiar sound that drew people in like a beacon. Farmers brought their plows to be mended, soldiers came to have their swords sharpened, and women dropped by to order new kitchen utensils. In this way, the blacksmith became a central figure in the social fabric of the village, a man who knew everyone and whom everyone knew. His forge was a place where secrets were shared, deals were struck, and disputes were settled. And while the work itself was grueling and dangerous, it also offered a sense of purpose and pride, a feeling that the blacksmith's labor mattered, that it served a tangible and necessary role in the life of the village. Yet, for all his importance, the blacksmith was not wealthy. Despite the constant demand for his services, his earnings were meager, barely enough to support his family and maintain the forge. Iron was expensive, and coal even more so. The blacksmith often found himself trading his work for goods rather than coin, a sack of grain for a plough repair, a haunch of venison for a new knife blade. His home was modest, his clothing simple, his hands scarred and calloused from years of toil. But what he lacked in wealth, the blacksmith made up for in respect. In a society where a man's worth was often measured by his skill and strength, the blacksmith stood as a figure of power and capability, a man who could shape raw metal into tools of survival and weapons of war. He was both feared and revered, a man whose forge fire burned as fiercely as his reputation. At the end of the day, as the sun sank low and the last embers of the forge glowed softly in the twilight, the blacksmith could look around at the fruits of his labor, the newly shod horse, the freshly forged sword, the gleaming set of kitchen knives, and know that his work would endure. The iron he had shaped would plough the fields, defend the village, and cook the evening meal. His sweat and toil were embedded in every piece he made, a silent, enduring testament to his skill and perseverance. The blacksmith's day began before the sun rose, often when the village was still wrapped in the cool silence of dawn. Unlike many other villagers who might start their labor later in the morning, the blacksmith had to prepare his forge early to make sure the fire was blazing hot and ready for the demanding work ahead. Starting a fire in those days was no small task. It wasn't just about lighting a flame. It was about creating and maintaining the intense heat necessary to soften the iron so it could be shaped. The blacksmith used charcoal, carefully tending the bellows to blow just the right amount of air into the forge, stoking the fire higher and higher until it roared like a living beast. The air around the forge was thick with smoke and the pungent smell of burning charcoal and heated metal. The heat was suffocating, even oppressive, often forcing the blacksmith to strip down to a thin shirt, or sometimes work bare-chested despite the cold outside. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with soot and grime that coated his skin. His hands, though toughened by years of labor, were constantly exposed to burns and cuts, risks that came with hammering glowing hot metal and handling sharp tools. Every movement had to be deliberate and precise because one slip could mean serious injury. The morning's work often started with repairs or small commissions, fixing a broken horseshoe, sharpening a farmer's sickle, or making nails for new construction. These tasks, though seemingly minor, were critical for village life. Without a sharp sickle, the harvest would be slower. Without nails, buildings could not be erected or repaired. Each piece of metalwork needed to be done quickly but carefully. The blacksmith worked with a rhythm, the steady beat of hammer on anvil echoing through the village like a heartbeat, marking the passage of the day. But the repetitive nature of the work did not mean it was easy. The physical toll was enormous. Swinging a heavy hammer over and over, bending and shaping metal, carrying heavy pieces of iron or steel. It was exhausting labor that required not just strength, but endurance. Days could stretch on endlessly, with barely time to rest between jobs. Even the simplest task could take hours when done properly. In addition to the physical demands, the blacksmith also had to contend with the mental challenges of his trade. Each piece of metal was different. Some might have impurities that made them brittle. Others might cool too quickly or unevenly, resulting in cracks or warping. The blacksmith needed to know his materials intimately, understanding how different types of iron or steel reacted to heat and hammering. This knowledge came only from years of experience, trial and error, and often costly mistakes. Beyond crafting and repairing tools and weapons, the blacksmith was also responsible for maintaining his own workshop and equipment. The bellows needed regular fixing, the anvil required upkeep, and the tools themselves, tongs, hammers, chisels, had to be kept in good condition. If any of these broke or wore out, the blacksmith had to either repair them himself or make new ones, further adding to his endless workload. Food and drink were often neglected during the busiest parts of the day. The blacksmith might eat a quick, simple meal, usually bread, cheese, and perhaps some salted meat, grabbed in brief moments between jobs. Drinking water was always nearby, but quenching thirst was tricky since the water could be cold or muddy, and the forge's heat made the blacksmith especially thirsty. In colder months, the work grew even more difficult. The chill seeped into bones and muscles, making movements stiff and painful. The fire was a blessing, but it also meant that the forge had to be kept going longer, burning precious fuel through long winter nights to keep the heat steady. Ice and snow outside the workshop made transport of materials harder, and the blacksmith's clothing damp and uncomfortable. Even with the heat of the forge, cold fingers and numb toes were common. Despite the hardships, the blacksmith was often a resilient and resourceful man. He learned to listen to the sounds of his work, the ring of the hammer, the hiss of metal cooling in water, and to read the color and texture of the heated metal. These signs told him when the iron was ready to be shaped, when it was too hot or not hot enough, and when the job was done right. This deep connection to his craft was a source of pride and identity, even as the physical pain and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. Yet the blacksmith's labor was also limited by the social and economic structures of the time. He was rarely his own master. Most blacksmiths worked under the authority of a local lord or guild, which controlled prices, materials, and output. This meant that even though his skills were indispensable, the blacksmith's earnings and freedom were constrained. He might have to turn down certain jobs or accept less pay than he deserved, simply because of guild rules or local customs. At the end of a long day, when the sun was low and the work was done, the blacksmith would often take a moment to clean his tools and tend the fire for the next day. The forge's embers would glow softly into the night, a faint reminder that tomorrow would bring the same endless cycle of heat, hammering, and sweat. The tools of a medieval blacksmith were simple in appearance but indispensable in function, and each one had a very specific purpose that demanded skillful use. The most iconic tool was the hammer, which came in various shapes and sizes, depending on the task at hand. A heavy sledgehammer was used for broad shaping and bending of thick iron bars, while lighter hammers allowed for detailed work, such as refining the edges of a blade or setting nails. The blacksmith's strength and precision were both tested with every swing. Too hard or off-target a blow could ruin the piece entirely. The anvil was the blacksmith's constant companion, a heavy block of iron or steel with a flat top and horned edges for shaping metal in curves and angles. It was not merely a surface to work on, but a tool itself, allowing the blacksmith to manipulate heated metal in countless ways. The anvil absorbed the force of each hammer strike, enabling the blacksmith to mold metal as if it were clay. Each anvil bore the marks of countless blows, worn smooth in some places and chipped in others, telling a silent story of years of labor. Tongs were another essential tool. These iron pincers allowed the blacksmith to grip and maneuver the glowing hot metal safely and accurately. Without tongs, handling the white-hot iron would be impossible without severe burns. There were many types of tongs, some designed for holding flat bars, others for round rods, and even specialized ones for gripping nails or horseshoes. The choice of tongs had to match the shape and size of the workpiece, requiring the blacksmith to carry a whole arsenal of gripping tools. Besides these basics, blacksmith also used chisels and punches to cut or indent metal, files and whetstones to sharpen edges, and bellows to keep the forge fire burning at the necessary high temperatures. The bellows were particularly crucial, as the air they pumped into the fire increased combustion, making the flames hot enough to soften steel, which has a melting point above 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. While the tools were important, the forge itself was the centerpiece of the blacksmith's workshop. The forge was essentially a hearth built from stone or brick, designed to contain and concentrate heat. It had a shallow pit filled with burning charcoal or coke, with a chimney or vent to direct smoke upward. The blacksmith fed the fire with coal or charcoal, carefully adding fuel to keep the temperature consistent. To maintain the necessary heat, the bellows were operated by hand or foot, blowing air into the forge's firepot to intensify the flames. This was a demanding task requiring rhythm and timing, as too little air would cause the fire to dwindle, and too much would scatter the embers and burn the fuel too quickly. The bellows operation often meant that the blacksmith, or an apprentice, was engaged in continuous, strenuous pumping, while simultaneously tending to the metalwork. Working at the forge was a constant battle against the elements inside the workshop. Sparks and embers flew unpredictably, sometimes landing on the blacksmith's clothing or skin. Smoke filled the air, often making breathing difficult and stinging the eyes. The intense heat radiated from the fire and the glowing metal, creating an environment that was nearly unbearable for long stretches. Yet, the blacksmith endured it daily, motivated by the necessity of his craft and the respect it commanded. The layout of the workshop was designed for efficiency. Tools were arranged within easy reach, and the forge was placed to allow quick movement between heating, hammering, and cooling stations. Nearby was usually a trough or bucket of water or oil for quenching hot metal. a critical step in tempering to harden the steel and improve its durability. Cooling the metal too quickly or too slowly could ruin a piece, so the blacksmith had to master these subtle variations in timing and technique. Despite the hard labor, the blacksmith's workshop was sometimes a place of creativity and experimentation. Different shapes, patterns, and finishes could be applied to metal objects, turning them into more than just utilitarian tools. Ornamental ironwork, decorative gates, elaborate hinges, and intricate locks showcase the blacksmith's artistry. These pieces might take longer to produce and required finer skills, but they also enhanced the blacksmith's reputation and attracted wealthier clients. In many cases, the blacksmith passed his knowledge down through apprenticeships. Young boys from the village would live and work with the blacksmith for several years, learning the trade by observation and repetition. Apprentices helped with the menial and dangerous tasks, feeding the fire, fetching tools, and holding pieces of metal, while gradually taking on more complex work. This system ensured that the craft survived from generation to generation, preserving techniques honed over centuries. The dependency on manual tools and physical labor meant that the blacksmith's output was limited by human endurance. There were no machines to speed up the work, so every item had to be forged by hand. This slow, meticulous process was a far cry from the mass production of later centuries. It demanded patience, skill, and unrelenting effort, a testament to the blacksmith's dedication to his craft. The materials a medieval blacksmith worked with were as unforgiving as the work itself. The primary raw material was iron, which was usually smelted from iron ore in small bloomery furnaces nearby. Unlike today's refined metals, the iron of that era was often impure and contained slag, waste material trapped inside the metal that weakened its strength and made shaping more difficult. The blacksmith had to learn to identify these flaws and work around them, a skill that came only with experience. Sometimes, the blacksmith would work with steel, which was iron that had been combined with carbon to increase hardness and durability. Producing good steel was a difficult and expensive process, so it was reserved for special items like swords, knives, or tools that needed to hold a sharp edge. The quality of the steel could vary dramatically, and the blacksmith had to understand how to heat and temper it properly to avoid brittleness or excessive softness. Charcoal was the preferred fuel for the forge because it burned hotter and cleaner than regular wood. Producing charcoal was itself a labor-intensive process, requiring the slow burning of wood in low oxygen conditions, often in remote woods far from the village. The blacksmith's dependence on charcoal meant that the availability of fuel could sometimes limit how much work he could do. Water was essential not only for the blacksmith's survival, but also for quenching heated metal. The process of quenching, rapidly cooling a hot piece of metal by dipping it into water or oil, was critical for hardening the metal and setting its properties. However, it was a delicate art. Quenching at the wrong temperature or too quickly could cause the metal to crack or warp, ruining hours of work. The blacksmith had to develop a feel for the timing and temperature, often relying on the color of the glowing metal to judge readiness. In addition to iron and steel, blacksmiths occasionally worked with other metals such as copper, bronze, and brass, especially when crafting decorative items, fittings, or jewelry. These metals melted at lower temperatures and required different techniques. While less common, working with these materials added variety and complexity to the blacksmith's skill set. The blacksmith's relationship with his materials was deeply tactile. He would touch the metal, feeling its heat and texture, observe its color changes as it moved from dull red to bright orange to white hot, and listen to the sound it made under his hammer. These sensory cues guided his work in an age without modern measuring tools or temperature gauges. Raw materials could be expensive and sometimes scarce. forcing the blacksmith to recycle scrap metal from broken tools or old weapons. This recycling was not just practical, but necessary for survival. Melting down and reforging old iron was a common practice, although it carried risks of contamination and weakening the metal if done improperly. The supply chain for materials was another challenge. Blacksmiths relied on local sources for iron ore, charcoal, and water, but these resources were not always guaranteed. Harsh winters, poor harvests, or political unrest could disrupt supply routes, leaving the blacksmith with less to work with. In some cases, the blacksmith's livelihood depended heavily on the goodwill of the village lord or the stability of the surrounding region. Handling raw materials also involved significant risks. Iron ore dust could irritate the lungs, and exposure to hot metal and burning charcoal carried the ever-present danger of burns and respiratory problems. Without modern protective gear, the blacksmith's health was often compromised over time. Despite these hardships, the materials were what gave the blacksmith his power to shape the world. From these raw elements, he created tools that fed the village, weapons that defended it, and everyday items that made life possible. The blacksmith's materials were not just substances, they were the foundation of the medieval economy and society, forged by his sweat and skill into objects that shaped history. Working as a medieval blacksmith wasn't just about wielding hammers and fire. It was a grueling, dangerous job that demanded constant physical endurance. The blacksmith's workday often began before sunrise and stretched long into the evening, especially during busy seasons like planting or war preparation, when demand for tools and weapons soared. Unlike modern workplaces with set hours and breaks, the blacksmith's schedule was dictated by necessity and opportunity. From the moment the forge fire was stoked, the blacksmith had to be on alert. The heat was intense and unrelenting, radiating not only from the glowing metal, but from the fire itself. Standing for hours near such high temperatures drained energy rapidly and risked heat exhaustion. The air was thick with smoke, ash, and dust, which made breathing difficult and could lead to chronic respiratory illnesses over time. Physical labor dominated every task. Swinging a heavy hammer repeatedly required upper body strength and stamina. Even holding hot metal with tongs demanded strong, steady hands. The pounding rhythm was relentless. There was no room for fatigue or distraction, as a single mistake could ruin a piece or cause injury. The blacksmith's body was their primary tool, and it was subjected to continuous stress. Burns were a common and painful hazard. Working with white-hot iron and molten metal meant the blacksmith's skin was often exposed to scalding heat, sparks, and molten slag. Protective clothing as we know it today didn't exist. Most blacksmiths wore simple wool or leather aprons and gloves that offered limited protection. Even so, injuries were routine, ranging from small burns to deep cuts or broken bones from accidents. The workshop was noisy and chaotic. The constant hammering on the anvil echoed through the village, and the hiss of steam as hot metal was quenched punctuated the air. Apprentices and helpers scurried about, carrying tools or tending the fire, adding to the constant bustle. Despite this, blacksmiths had to maintain focus and precision, balancing speed with care. Apart from physical strain, mental exhaustion was also a factor. The blacksmith had to make quick, accurate decisions about the temperature of the metal, the force of each hammer blow, and the timing of quenching. There was no room for guesswork. Every step influenced the strength and usability of the final product. The pressure to produce quality items on time, especially during crises like wars or harvests, added to the mental toll. Social expectations were heavy as well. The blacksmith was often seen as a pillar of the community, expected to provide essential goods for farmers, soldiers, and villagers. Failure or delay could have serious consequences, from lost crops to unarmed defenses. This responsibility created an ongoing stress that weighed on the blacksmith beyond the physical dangers. Despite the hardships, some blacksmiths found a certain pride in their endurance. The tough work forged not only metal, but character, resilience, and a reputation for strength. The blacksmith's calloused hands and soot-covered face were badges of honor, proof of a life dedicated to a demanding but vital craft. So, was being a medieval blacksmith just boring history to put you to sleep? Maybe not. Behind the rhythm of hammer strikes and glowing embers was a world of relentless hard labor, dangerous conditions, and constant challenges that made life anything but easy. From mastering unforgiving materials like rough iron and temperamental steel, to working long hours in smoke-filled workshops with the ever-present risk of burns and injury, the medieval blacksmith's day was packed with struggle and skill. Not the relaxing bedtime story you might expect. Sure, the job wasn't glamorous. It was dirty, exhausting, and physically punishing. The blacksmith's tools were basic, the materials unpredictable, and the workday unforgiving. But through that hard, gritty life, the blacksmith shaped the tools, weapons, and everyday items that kept medieval society running. Their craft was essential, demanding, and yes, often frustrating. So while it might seem like boring history, the truth is that life as a medieval blacksmith sucked in many ways, but it also forged resilience, skill, and a deep connection to the world around them. If anything, it's a powerful reminder of how tough life was before modern technology made things easier, and how much we owe to those who did the hard, gritty work. Thanks for sticking with this deep dive into medieval smithing life. I hope it gave you a new appreciation for that humble, hard-working figure standing behind the forge.